When Americans think of tropical paradise, they picture crystal clear waters, swaying palm trees, and endless possibilities for a fresh start. But sometimes what looks like paradise on the surface can hide something much darker underneath. Today, we're diving into a case that shocked investigators across 2 countries and revealed just how far someone will go to cover up the truth. This is the story of Devil's Island, where the American dream turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the autumn of 2011, a young American couple arrived on the remote Caribbean islands of Panama with hopes of starting their new life together. Yvonne Baldelli, recently divorced and looking for adventure, had fallen head over heels for Brian Bermager, a decorated former Marine who seemed to have everything going for him. Brian had served 7 years in the Marine Corps, stationed in Washington, D.C., as part of the Honor Guard. There were even photographs of him standing in the White House alongside President George W. Bush. From the outside looking in, this guy had the perfect all-American persona that would make any woman's heart skip a beat. After completing his military service, Brian decided he needed to decompress and find his next chapter. Panama seemed like the ideal place to do exactly that. The cost of living was incredibly low, the beaches were pristine, and for someone with musical aspirations like Brian, the local bar scene offered plenty of opportunities to perform. Yvonne was absolutely smitten with this man. She saw him as her Prince Charming, the person she'd been waiting for her entire life. When Brian suggested they pack up everything and move to Panama together, she didn't hesitate for a second. Michelle Valenzuela, Yvonne's sister, watched as her sibling threw herself completely into this relationship. Yvonne was the type of person who gave 100% of herself when she fell in love, and she expected that same level of commitment in return. But Michelle had her reservations about Brian from the very beginning, despite her concerns. Yvonne was determined to make this work. She brought 2 sewing machines with her to Panama, planning to start a clothing business making bathing suits for tourists. With her beloved dog, Georgia May, by her side, she was ready to build the life she'd always dreamed of. The couple settled on Isla Carnero in Bocas del Toro, a small island community where expats from around the world came to escape their old lives. They rented a house right on the water, and Brian quickly became a fixture at the local bars, playing guitar and singing for food and drinks. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent regular emails home to her family, painting a picture of tropical bliss. She described their morning runs on the beach, swimming in the crystal-clear ocean, and the excitement of building something new together in paradise. The local expat community welcomed them with open arms. Bar owners let Brian perform in exchange for meals and free alcohol. Yvonne seemed genuinely happy, and to anyone watching from the outside, they looked like a couple living their best life. But beneath the surface, cracks were already starting to show. Brian's drinking was becoming more and more problematic. What started as a few beers after performances turned into heavy drinking sessions that lasted well into the night. Some locals noticed that his musical abilities seemed to deteriorate the more he drank, describing his intoxicated singing voice as resembling a hound dog on a porch. More concerning were the signs of trouble in paradise that some observant neighbors began to notice. There were reports of loud arguments coming from their house, and on at least one occasion, locals saw bruises on Yvonne's face that she tried desperately to hide. Despite these warning signs, Yvonne's family back in the United States remained optimistic about the relationship. Her emails continued to arrive regularly, filled with stories of their tropical adventures. Her father, Jim Faust, could picture every detail of their new life based on her vivid descriptions. He genuinely believed that Brian might be the one for his daughter. But then, around Thanksgiving 2011, something changed. The frequent, cheerful emails from Yvonne began to slow down. Michelle noticed immediately that the communication pattern had shifted, and her sisterly instincts started kicking in. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Yvonne. Finally, on December 14th, Michelle received a text message from an unknown number. It wasn't from Yvonne at all, but from Brian, asking to make arrangements to pick up his truck that he'd left at Michelle's house in California. When Michelle called the number, Brian calmly explained that he and Yvonne were no longer together. He claimed they'd gotten into a fight because she'd discovered he had a child from a previous relationship, something he'd never mentioned before. According to Brian, Yvonne had simply packed up and left without a word. This revelation was devastating for Yvonne, who was unable to have children due to a medical condition. Learning that the man she'd sacrificed everything for had been hiding the existence of his own child would have been absolutely earth-shattering. But Michelle wasn't buying Brian's story. When she suggested they go to the police together to file a missing persons report, since he was the last person to see Yvonne, Brian seemed reluctant to get involved. That's when Michelle decided to dig deeper into her email account, where she discovered a message she'd previously overlooked. It was from Yvonne herself, sent shortly after Brian's call, explaining that she and Brian had broken up and that she was headed to Costa Rica with a man she'd met when they first arrived in Panama. The email described Brian as a lying, cheating individual and claimed that Yvonne should have trusted her instincts about him from the beginning. While the message provided some explanation for what had happened, something about it didn't sit right with Michelle. The timing seemed off, and certain phrases in the email just didn't sound like something her sister would say. Yvonne had never been the type to run off impulsively with someone she barely knew, especially after such a traumatic discovery about Brian's secret child. 3 weeks later, another email arrived from Yvonne, this time saying she was getting homesick and making plans to return home by the second week of January. She mentioned she'd been staying with someone and was looking forward to seeing everyone again. This second email provided some comfort to the family, who assumed Yvonne would show up at their planned family gathering in January. But when that reunion came and went without any sign of Yvonne, Michelle knew something was terribly wrong. Her father, Jim, shared her concerns. After decades of knowing his daughter, he was certain that Yvonne would never simply disappear without maintaining contact with her family. She was too responsible, too caring, and too connected to the people she loved to just vanish into thin air. That's when Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands and investigate further. She reached out to a tech-savvy cousin who could trace the IP addresses of the emails supposedly sent by Yvonne from Panama and Costa Rica. What they discovered would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark truth about what really happened on Devil's Island. The cousin's investigation revealed something that sent chills down Michelle's spine. The emails that were supposedly sent from Panama showed IP addresses consistent with that location. But the email claiming Yvonne was in Costa Rica, living with another man, showed an IP address from Dana Point, California, exactly where Brian was now living. This meant that someone had been using Yvonne's email account to impersonate her, sending messages to her family from Brian's computer in the United States. The realization hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Her sister wasn't hiding out in Costa Rica with some mysterious new boyfriend. Someone had been playing an elaborate game of deception, and that someone was Brian Brimmager. With this damning evidence in hand, Michelle knew she had to act fast. She contacted the FBI, where she met with Special Agent Andrew Masters, a seasoned investigator who immediately recognized the significance of what Michelle had uncovered. The IP address evidence was a smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that foul play was involved. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into Yvonne's disappearance, with Masters taking the lead. They contacted the State Department to check immigration records, which confirmed what Yvonne's family had suspected all along. There was no record of her ever leaving Panama or entering Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Yvonne's family couldn't wait for the wheels of justice to turn slowly. They decided to take matters into their own hands and travel to Panama to search for answers themselves. They connected with Don Winner, a legendary investigator and former U.S. intelligence officer who had built a reputation for solving impossible cases in Central America. Winner was known throughout Panama as the person to call when bad things happened to American citizens. He'd already helped put away 3 serial killers and had an uncanny ability to crack the most complex murder cases. When he heard Yvonne's story, he immediately knew they were dealing with something sinister. His assessment was blunt and chilling. The chances that Yvonne was running around Costa Rica with some other man were essentially zero. Winner believed they were looking at a murder case, and Brian Brimmager was their prime suspect. Back in the United States, the FBI was putting pressure on Brian, conducting surveillance and building their case. They discovered that within weeks of Yvonne's disappearance, Brian had not only returned to California, but had gotten engaged and married to Kristen Verkhoven, a woman he'd met while she was working at the White House. The timeline was shocking. Brian had proposed to Kristen just days after Yvonne disappeared in Panama. Wedding photos showed a couple that appeared blissfully happy, completely unaware of the dark secret that lurked beneath Brian's charming exterior. What made this revelation even more disturbing was that Kristen was the mother of Brian's secret child, the very discovery that had allegedly caused the final fight between Brian and Yvonne. Brian had been living a double life, maintaining relationships with 2 women simultaneously, neither fully aware of the other's existence. In Panama, Winner organized a press conference with local authorities to publicize Yvonne's disappearance and put pressure on anyone who might have information. For the first time, Panamanian police officially declared that Yvonne was the victim of foul play and named Brian Brimmager as their primary suspect. The press conference sent shockwaves around the world. Here was a decorated former Marine, someone who had served his country with honor and stood in the White House with the president, now being accused of murdering his girlfriend in a tropical paradise. As news of the case spread, witnesses began coming forward with disturbing accounts of Brian and Yvonne's relationship. Local bar owners and residents described a pattern of verbal and physical abuse that painted a very different picture from the happy couple Yvonne had portrayed in her emails home. One bar owner recalled seeing Yvonne with black eyes and bruises around her face. When asked about her injuries, she tried to hide them and refused to discuss what had happened. The revelation that Brian had been physically abusing Yvonne was devastating for her family, who had no idea she was suffering in silence. Jeff Salzman, who owned one of the local establishments where Brian performed, described him as a scary person who he didn't want to be around. The image of the clean-cut, all-American Marine was crumbling as more and more people shared their experiences with the couple. Yvonne's family organized search parties to comb through the dense jungle and swampland surrounding the island where she'd disappeared. The terrain was brutal. Thick tropical vegetation filled with spiders, snakes, and every kind of dangerous creature imaginable. The water was murky and rancid, making it nearly impossible to see anything beneath the surface, despite the challenging conditions. Volunteers joined the family in their desperate search for any trace of Yvonne. They found various items, a purse, medicine bottles, even a U.S. passport. But none belonged to Yvonne. Each discovery raised hopes only to dash them moments later. The search was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Lauren Beyer, Yvonne's niece, found herself in the heartbreaking position of hoping to find her aunt, while simultaneously dreading what that discovery might look like after so much time had passed. Back in California, the FBI was closing in on Brian Brimmager. Agent Masters had obtained a warrant to search Brian's residence, where he made a crucial discovery. Sitting on a table in Brian's living room was a white Sony Vaio laptop computer, the exact same type of computer that Yvonne had taken with her to Panama. When Masters saw the laptop, he immediately suspected it belonged to Yvonne. His instincts proved correct. The computer contained a wealth of evidence that would ultimately help unravel the mystery of what happened on that remote Caribbean island. The laptop revealed Brian's internet search history, which painted a chilling picture of premeditation. In the days following Yvonne's disappearance, someone had used the computer to search for information about removing blood from mattresses and other incriminating queries that suggested someone was trying to cover up a violent crime. Perhaps most damning of all, the computer contained evidence that Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to send those fake messages to her family. The digital trail clearly showed that the emails claiming she was alive and well in Costa Rica had actually been composed and sent from Brian's residence in California. The investigation also uncovered financial records showing that Brian had been using Yvonne's debit card to withdraw money from her accounts after her disappearance. ATM surveillance footage captured him making these transactions, providing visual proof that he was accessing her finances while letting her family believe she was safe. As the evidence mounted against him, Brian Brimmager continued to maintain his innocence and live his new life as if nothing had happened. He spent his days playing golf, caring for his young daughter, and enjoying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that his new marriage provided. But the FBI wasn't about to let him escape justice. They were building an airtight case, piece by piece, that would eventually bring him to account for what investigators believed was a carefully planned and executed murder in paradise. In 2013, nearly 2 years after Yvonne had vanished without a trace, the FBI finally made their move. Special Agent Andrew Masters approached Brian Brimmager's apartment with handcuffs in hand, ready to end this elaborate charade once and for all. When Masters knocked on the door, Brian answered and invited him inside, claiming he'd been expecting this visit. For more than 4 hours, while Brian casually babysat his young daughter, Masters grilled him about the inconsistencies in his story and the mounting evidence against him. Brian continued to stick to his original narrative. He insisted that Yvonne had left him for another man, that she'd gone to Costa Rica willingly, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But when confronted with the IP address evidence and the fact that her supposed emails from Costa Rica were actually sent from his computer, Brian began to stumble. The pressure was mounting, and cracks were starting to show in his carefully constructed facade. Masters could see the doubt creeping into Brian's eyes as the evidence piled up against him. But even then, this former Marine refused to break. Brian was arrested and charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne's death. However, without a body, prosecutors couldn't yet bring murder charges. That would all change in the most dramatic way possible. In June 2013, a local worker clearing brush on the very island where Brian and Yvonne had lived made a discovery that would finally bring closure to this tragic case. Hidden in the dense jungle, just a few hundred yards from where Yvonne's family had spent days searching, he found a duffel bag. When the worker unbuckled the clasp and looked inside, he discovered Yvonne's skeletonized remains. After 2 years in the tropical elements, only bones remained of the vibrant young woman who had come to Panama with such hope and excitement. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. This was Yvonne Baldelli, and her remains told a horrific story of what had really happened in paradise. The autopsy revealed that she had been dismembered, most likely after being stabbed in the back at least twice. The discovery of Yvonne's body allowed prosecutors to finally bring murder charges against Brian Brimmiger. But for Michelle Valenzuela, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her sister, time was running out in her own battle for survival. Michelle had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and doctors gave her just weeks to live. Despite her deteriorating condition, she was determined to see this case through to the end. In what would be one of her final acts of love for her sister, Michelle agreed to give crucial testimony while she still could. The courtroom scene was heartbreaking. Michelle, weakened by cancer but fueled by determination, sat directly across from Brian Brimmiger and told the world about her sister's disappearance. She pointed him out in the courtroom, identifying him as the man who had destroyed her family. The testimony was exhausting, and Michelle collapsed afterward from the strain. But she had accomplished what she set out to do. Her words would be preserved forever, ensuring that Yvonne's story would be told and that justice would prevail. Days later, Michelle passed away, having given everything she had to find the truth about what happened to her beloved sister. Meanwhile, investigators made another breakthrough that would seal Brian's fate. Remember that machete he had sold on Facebook after Yvonne's disappearance? The one he had joked about using to chop up one stripper. The FBI had tracked it down and subjected it to advanced forensic testing. While Brian had cleaned the blade thoroughly, he had missed something crucial. When investigators removed the handle, they found Yvonne's blood and DNA trapped underneath where no amount of cleaning could reach it. This was the smoking gun that proved beyond any doubt that this weapon had been used to dismember her body. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Brian Brimmiger's house of lies finally collapsed. His lawyers advised him that fighting these charges would be futile, and in early 2016 he finally admitted defeat. In a dramatic reversal, Brian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. After nearly 5 years of lies, manipulation, and deception, he finally admitted in open court that he had killed Yvonne Baldelli. He offered an apology to her family, but his words rang hollow after everything he had put them through. The judge sentenced Brian Brimmiger to 26 years in federal prison. For a man who had once stood in the White House as an honored Marine, this was a spectacular fall from grace. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, paying for the terrible crime he committed in paradise. With the case finally resolved, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family for a proper burial. In a touching ceremony, they laid her to rest at sea, knowing that she loved the ocean and would finally be at peace in the waters she had found so beautiful. The case of Devil's Island serves as a chilling reminder that paradise can quickly turn into hell when dangerous people are involved. Yvonne Baldelli went to Panama looking for love and adventure, but instead found herself trapped with a man capable of unthinkable violence. Brian Brimmiger's ability to live multiple lives simultaneously, decorated Marine, loving husband, and cold-blooded killer, shows how easily predators can hide among us. His wife, Kristen, continues to support him and visit him in prison, apparently still believing in his innocence despite his guilty plea. The real heroes of this story are the family members who never gave up searching for the truth. Michelle Valenzuela's determination to find justice for her sister, even while battling terminal cancer, demonstrates the power of love and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Today, Brian Brimmiger sits in federal prison, where he will remain until 2037. The tropical paradise of Panama continues to attract visitors from around the world, but for those who knew Yvonne Baldelli, the islands will forever be haunted by the memory of what happened there. This case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are hiding behind the most respectable facades. A military uniform, a charming smile, and an all-American persona can mask the darkest of intentions. And sometimes, what looks like paradise from the outside can be nothing more than Devil's Island in disguise.